What if the upgrade everyone tells you to buy first is actually the wrong move for most people watching this right now?
Realtek just dropped their fourth PC for Newbies video and buried inside the comments, and the breakdown itself is a debate that's splitting the entire builder community right down the middle. RAM or graphics card? Desktop or gaming laptop? And the answers are not what the loudest voices on the internet want you to believe.
Here's the thing that gets me every single time I watch one of these breakdowns. Everyone assumes the graphics card is always the answer because it's the flashy upgrade. It's the one you can screenshot and post. It's the one that gives you bragging rights. But the creator flips that assumption almost immediately. And honestly, it's the kind of nuance that most tech channels skip entirely because nuance doesn't get clicks the same way absolutes do.
The real answer, according to the breakdown, comes down to one brutally simple test. Open your task manager while you're working. Watch your RAM usage, if it's maxing out. If your system is compressing memory, if it's committing more than it physically has, that's not a maybe situation anymore. That's your machine screaming for help. And I have to say, this is the kind of practical advice that actually separates a useful tech channel from one that just repeats talking points. You're not guessing anymore. You're reading your own system's vital signs.
But if you're a gamer sitting on 16 gigs of RAM wondering whether to jump to 32 or grab a better card, the video is almost brutally direct about it. Don't bother with the RAM. You'll barely feel it. Multitasking gets a little smoother, sure, but the graphics card is the difference between choppy frame rates and buttery smooth gameplay you can actually feel in your hands. That's not a subtle upgrade. That's a night and day shift in how the game plays.
Now here's where things get spicy, and where I think the real controversy of this whole video lives. The 8GB VRAM debate. Is it dead? Is it dying? Is it already a relic? And the comment section is genuinely split on this, which tells you everything about how divisive this topic has become in 2026.
One commenter straight up says AMD is still releasing new cards with 4 GB of VRAM, so how could 8 gigs possibly be considered outdated? That's a fair point on paper. But then you've got other users in the thread arguing the exact opposite, saying that the moment you push into 1400p or 2K gaming with anything close to max settings, 8 gigs starts choking, especially on newer AAA titles built on engines like Unreal Engine 5.
The creator's own stance is refreshingly honest here, and it's not the answer you'd expect from someone trying to farm engagement. He says 8 gigs of VRAM is not obsolete, but it's close to its ceiling. And he goes even further, admitting something most tech reviewers would never say out loud. He wishes NVIDIA had put 10 gigs on the RTX 5060 instead of 8, and 14 or even 12 gigs on the 5060 Ti, instead of the current 16 gig configuration paired with what he considers an underpowered GPU core to match it. That's not a hype man talking. That's someone willing to criticize the exact products he's recommending, and that kind of transparency is rare in this space.
And this is where the comments get real. One user chimes in describing their own experience running a 5060 with 8 gigs of VRAM for pure 2D design work using Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign, occasionally dipping into demanding titles like Black Myth Wukong. Their verdict? It runs smooth, never comes close to hitting that 8 gig ceiling, and honestly are questioning whether upgrading to a 5070 is just pure fear of missing out rather than an actual need. That kind of self-aware admission from a real user carries more weight than any marketing slide ever could.
But then flip to another commenter who says their RTX 5090, one of the most powerful consumer cards that exist right now, is dropping frames in ARC at 4K resolution. If a flagship card with an absurd amount of horsepower is struggling, what does that actually say about VRAM sufficiency at the high end versus what's happening down at the budget tier? This is the kind of contradiction that makes you realize benchmarks alone don't tell the whole story. Game optimization, engine choice, and resolution targets completely change the equation.
Let's talk about the third question buried in this video, because it's honestly one of the most underrated breakdowns of core PC building logic I've heard in a while. Esports gaming versus AAA gaming require completely different hardware priorities, and most beginners get this backwards constantly.
For AAA titles, you're chasing resolution. You want 4K, you want HDR, you want ray tracing cranked up. Your frame rate targets are modest, maybe 60 to 180 frames per second tops. That means your money goes almost entirely into the graphics card. Your CPU can be a modest 6 or 8 core chip and it'll barely break a sweat.
But esports titles flip that entire priority list upside down. You're not chasing resolution anymore. You're chasing raw frame output, sometimes pushing past 500 frames per second in games like Valorant. And when you drop resolution that low to hit those numbers, your CPU suddenly becomes the bottleneck because it's processing input signals and game logic at an insane rate. This is exactly why chips like the Ryzen 7 9800X3D dominate esports benchmarks. It's not raw clock speed, it's that massive 3D V-cache doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes.
And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. The video claims you can pair a Ryzen 7 9800X3D with a modest 8GB RTX 5060 Ti and still hit around 1000 frames per second in Valorant. Let that sink in for a second. You don't need a flagship graphics card to dominate in esports. You need the right CPU architecture. That single fact alone dismantles the assumption half the comment section is making that more VRAM automatically equals a better gaming experience across the board.
Now let's get into the debate that honestly has the most emotional weight in the comments: desktop or gaming laptop. Which one actually makes more financial sense?
The creator's answer here surprised me because it's not the typical enthusiast bias you'd expect from a PC building channel. He flat out says, if you're a student, buy the laptop first. Not because desktops aren't better performers, they absolutely are, but because he lived through that exact decision paralysis himself back in his own school years, comparing a 15 or 20-year-old equivalent laptop against building an equivalent desktop.
His reasoning cuts deep into something most tech reviewers completely ignore. It's not just about raw performance per dollar. A laptop comes bundled with a screen, a keyboard, sometimes even a mouse thrown in. If you're starting from absolute zero with no peripherals, that hidden cost of building out a full desktop setup adds up fast, sometimes an extra few $100s you didn't budget for. One commenter in the thread backs this up with real numbers, describing buying a desktop for around $660 equivalent, using existing peripherals they already owned, versus a laptop around $620 that came with a free mouse and everything included out of the box.
But then another voice in the comments pushes back hard, arguing that if you're not a student, if you're working full-time and coming home in the evenings, desktop is the clear winner every single time. Their argument is blunt. Laptops thermal throttle under sustained gaming loads, they degrade faster from heat cycling, and long-term reliability just can't compete with a desktop's superior cooling and upgrade path. That's a real tension point, and honestly, both sides have legitimate ammunition here, depending entirely on your living situation and how you actually use the machine day to day.
There's also this fascinating aside from the video that I don't think gets enough attention. The creator makes a point of saying you should never directly compare desktops and laptops as if they're competing for the same job. They're built for two completely different use cases. Desktop is about performance ceiling, personalization, and long-term upgradability. Laptop is about mobility, full stop, and that mobility comes with real trade-offs in thermal performance and future-proofing.
And then there's the final question that ties this whole video together in a way I didn't expect. Does pushing frame rates higher than your monitor's refresh rate actually matter? Or is it just wasted performance?
The answer is more layered than a simple yes or no. For casual AAA gaming, pushing way past your refresh rate can actually introduce screen tearing and visual artifacts that make the experience worse, not better. That's counterintuitive for anyone who assumes more frames always equals a better picture. But for competitive esports players, it's a completely different story. Higher frame output means lower input latency, which translates directly into a real, measurable advantage over opponents running lower frame rates, even if your monitor physically can't display all those extra frames. Every millisecond shaved off your input delay is a millisecond your opponent doesn't have, and in competitive shooters, that gap decides who wins the fight.
So where does this leave the whole debate? The comments section is a battlefield of anecdotal evidence, personal builds, and genuinely conflicting real-world experiences. And that's actually what makes this conversation so compelling. There's no single universal answer here. Your ideal upgrade path depends entirely on whether you're gaming or working, whether you're chasing resolution or frame rate, whether you're mobile or stationary, and whether you're a student weighing every dollar or someone with disposable income who wants the absolute best performance ceiling money can buy.
What strikes me most after digging through this entire breakdown and the surrounding discussion is how much of the tech world's conventional wisdom falls apart the second you actually interrogate your specific use case instead of blindly following whatever upgrade is trending. 8 gigs of VRAM isn't dead, but it's living on borrowed time depending on what you're asking it to do. RAM upgrades are invisible until suddenly they're not. And the desktop versus laptop war has no winner, only a better fit depending on who's asking.
There's one more thread buried in the comments that I think deserves way more attention than it's getting. And it actually complicates this whole conversation even further. Several users bring up motherboard connectivity as an overlooked bottleneck that nobody talks about when they're planning a build. One commenter describes running 12 RGB devices, including 10 fans, on a board that only has two 5-volt 3-pin headers and 2 USB internal ports. That's not a graphics card problem. That's not a RAM problem. That's a planning problem that can quietly wreck your entire build experience if you don't account for it before you start buying parts. It's a reminder that raw specs on a spec sheet don't tell you the whole story about whether a component actually fits your real-world setup.
Another user brings up something equally practical, arguing that before you even touch your graphics card or your RAM, you should be optimizing your monitor settings first. They walk through a detailed process of adjusting sharpness levels, enabling integer scaling through NVIDIA's control panel, and switching between resolution modes depending on whether they're doing office work or gaming. Their argument is that a properly tuned display can make an existing graphics card feel like a genuine upgrade without spending a single extra dollar. Whether or not you buy that argument fully, it does highlight something the video itself never really addresses. Hardware upgrades aren't the only lever you can pull. Sometimes the free adjustments matter just as much as the $400 graphics card you're eyeing.
Then there's the budget-conscious crowd in the comments, and honestly, their frustration feels earned. Multiple users point out that prices on nearly everything, RAM, SSDs, graphics cards, have spiked dramatically over the past year. One commenter says an SSD that cost roughly $40 equivalent last year is now double that price. Another says they're watching 16GB RAM kits that used to sell for around $75 and wishing they'd bought 2 sticks back when prices were reasonable. This pricing pressure changes the entire calculus of the RAM versus graphics card debate, because when everything costs more, the margin for error in your upgrade decision shrinks fast. You can't afford to guess wrong anymore when every component category is inflated.
And this is where I think the video's underlying message really lands hardest. The creator isn't just answering 4 isolated questions about hardware. He's teaching a mindset. Look at your actual usage patterns before you spend a single dollar. Don't chase hype. Don't upgrade because everyone online tells you the graphics card is always the priority. Check your task manager. Understand whether you're bottlenecked by CPU or GPU. Understand whether your use case demands resolution or frame rate. That diagnostic approach is worth more than any specific hardware recommendation buried in the video, because hardware changes every single year, but the method for figuring out what you actually need stays the same no matter what generation of components you're shopping for.
Even the laptop versus desktop debate, when you really sit with it, isn't about which one is objectively superior. It's about matching the tool to the life you're actually living right now, not the life you imagine you'll be living once you have more money or more space. A student cramming in a dorm room has a completely different set of constraints than someone working from a dedicated home office with room to spread out. Pretending there's one universal correct answer is exactly the kind of oversimplified thinking that gets people to buy hardware they don't need or skip upgrades they desperately do need.
So, here's the real question this whole video leaves hanging in the air. When the next generation of graphics cards launches and VRAM capacities inevitably creep up across every tier, will 8 gigs finally cross that line into true obsolescence, or will game developers keep optimizing around it the same way they always have, leaving this entire debate exactly where it started?
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the latest update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.